So I'm just going to keep breaking rules today because it helps us to remember that sometimes, actually oftentimes, Jesus and his disciples broke rules. Now today, one of the rules was talking about washing your hands before you eat. The disciples must have looked like a bunch of people at the Minnesota State Fair, going around touching other people and touching other things and opening doors and sitting down on dirty benches and then going to the cookie stand and having some cookies and then going over to a sandwich stand and eating some things and not washing their hands. Okay, I've been one of those people, but I try to only do it at the fair. So I want to ask, does anyone else get just a little uncomfortable when you're at a restaurant and in the bathroom the sign says employees must wash hands before returning to work? It kind of creeps me out. It's a little bit like telling somebody, put your sock on before you put your shoe on, right? Do we need a big sign? Today, the disciples were not serving food, goodness. They were just eating, and they didn't wash their hands. Just one of the many rules they didn't follow. Jesus proclaimed something that it's not what goes in a person that defiles them, but it's what comes out. So does anybody here like chocolate and aren't patient enough to stick it in your pocket for it to melt later? Anybody? Oh, see, you guys got to remember when I come and ask questions, they're not rhetorical. Oh, there we go. That's another open hand. You need to eat them, okay? Open it up, eat them. I have 2 pieces left. Oh, now I see lots of hands come up. Yeah. So go ahead and eat them. No, you can't stick it in your pocket. You got to eat it. Yeah. Or I'm going to give it to somebody else. I'm not kidding. You started, okay, now will you spit it out? That would be disgusting, wouldn't it? The poor little girl that I told to do that stopped eating her candy bar and looked at me last night. See, it's not what goes in. Yeah, if you set aside the whole, we need to be careful about what we eat. But it's when it comes out. It's when it comes out. I think it's interesting how the lectionary does some editing. Actually, there's a good line in there that got edited out, that it's what that goes into the sewer that is what defiles a person. You'll have to look it up in Scripture. Jesus is not just talking about washing hands here. He's talking about what comes out of our mouth and what comes out through our thinking and our feeling and how it hurts other people. So it is what we talk about. Does anybody know the list of things that we're not to talk about in public? And especially not in church? What? Politics. Oh, yes. What else? Say it loud. Religion. But we can talk about that in church, right? But not outside of church. So that's an outside of church. That's a good one. What are some other ones? Money. Ooh. See, when you get chocolate, you're just on top of it. What's another one that people don't like to talk about? Gossip? Gossip is talking about stuff we shouldn't be talking about, right? Yeah, but we don't like to talk about when, especially be held accountable when we're one of the people sharing that story. Another one. Sex. Thank you very much. Okay, and another one, sometimes we talk about it in church, but oftentimes people don't like to talk about death. That's a pretty good list, isn't it? So I'm going to break some rules today. I'm going to encourage you to think about and talk about some of those taboo things. So let's start with money. Okay? People don't like to talk about money, right? So I'm going to ask you to turn to somebody and say the word money. We'll say it all together so you're not too freaked out. 1, 2, 3. Money. Money. Okay, that's all I want to cover today for money. That's a good way to take care of it. Jesus states that evil intentions come from the human heart. Now, we usually think about the heart as a place where loving, caring things come. But it's also a place where evil and hurtful things come. I want to tell you something else, and I'm always glad to share these little things that I learned in seminary so that it makes it worth all those hours of studying. In Greek, the word heart is the same word as the word mind. So anytime you hear mind or heart in Scripture, say the other one as well. Because they weren't separated. That became something that happened later. It was called the fact-value split, and we still live in that. You know, you come to church to talk about soft, cuddly things, and then you go to the business meeting to talk about business. Well, that didn't exist in Scripture. And I would kind of argue that it's a false understanding that we can divide things out as thoughts and feelings. I don't think it's that easy. So, evil intentions come from within us, from the heart and the mind, working together. I guess that eliminates the excuse, she made me do it, a lesson Eve and Adam did not quite understand. So you can't blame others. They might influence your heart and mind, but it's coming from within you when you do such things. So what does Jesus do next? Well, he breaks some more rules. He breaks rules of what you ought to talk about in church. And he certainly covers the sex topic. There's a TV show called Sheldon. He's a young boy around 10, and he's extremely bright. Have you watched it? I see a few heads nod. He's extremely bright, and in his brightness, or maybe a little bit of his personality, he can be a bit brash to correct people who may not be right. So he is moved up to high school to take high school age classes, and he brings home a high school age book. Now, his mom is a very kind-hearted, very thoughtful mother and daughter and wife, and she's very religious. She goes to church on a regular basis, and when she sees this high school age book, she grabs it and tells him, "You are not going to read this filth in my house." And he reaches over to his bedside stand and grabs his Bible and said, "Mom, you better take this too, because this is full of sex, rape, murder, all kinds of terrible things." So there you go. So let's do it again. Turn to somebody next to you, and it's okay if your cheeks turn pink, and say the word sex. Can we do this? 1, 2, 3, sex. Oh, I love how that makes everybody giddy and laugh. Although it still makes people uncomfortable. There's a lot in Scripture about money and about sex. So let's move on to the other things that make us quite uncomfortable. Let's talk about politics. Oh, man, that got an even bigger response. Okay, now remember, I ask questions, and I'm not just asking rhetorical questions. So I invite you to raise your hand if you have ever voted Republican, Democrat, or Independent. Ever voted Republican, Independent, or Democrat? Is there anybody here who's never voted? Okay. So I guess you have some political opinions, right? I want to tell you, I personally think this is the best week of political news I've seen in a very long time. If you happen to watch any of the news and see McCain's services, multiple services, conversations about who he invited to speak at different services and why, I'm certain there was somebody mentioned that you have respect for. So President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama were both asked to speak at his service in D.C. And they said they were surprised that he asked. Now, I don't think there are a lot of world leaders who talk about being surprised or humbled about something. There were other politicians there: Dick Cheney, Al Gore, President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Justice Kennedy, Senator Amy Klobuchar, and more. So raise your hand if you voted for one of those people. Yeah, see, we've got politics in our life, right? But this week, the politics were different. I really appreciated his intention when he asked people from different parties to speak. When he was laying in the Capitol, and I may not have all these details correct, so I apologize, but it's the break rule Sunday, right? So you'll forgive me, I'm close to the font. He asked for not just the majority, but the majority and minority of the House and Senate to come forward and present the wreath. He broke the rules. And it also came out that he had talked about really breaking the rules when he was running for president, because he toyed with asking for a running mate that wasn't a Republican. Now, they didn't just polish him up and talk about him as this wonderful person who was perfect all the time. In fact, it was quite clear that when he was passionate about things, he maybe wasn't always as polished as he should be. They even threw out he could talk like a sailor. I don't know any sailors, but I think I can guess what that means. But he was very intentional to send a message that was bigger than his life, that was about what was important to him, not just about America, but also what I hear in Scripture. Did you know that not all of the religious people in Scripture got along with each other? They fought a lot. It's hard when we fight in church. It's hard. It's hard to disagree with somebody. It's hard to have someone disagree with you and hurt your feelings or feel not heard. It's true. But in crafting the week of services, which took him much time and intentionality, he wanted to send this message about it being important, yes, to have different opinions, because he certainly just didn't ask the people who had the same opinions on the same issues with him. Yes, have different opinions and work together and come together for a common good. I'm going to invite you this week to break a few rules. And one of them is, if you hear one little bit of the whole week, whether it's about Dick Cheney or Aretha Franklin, who had a close to 6-hour funeral, So don't ever complain if somebody goes over an hour at a funeral. I will not make you sit through a 6-hour one. But even to hear the stories that came out there of things that she had to face. If you've ever watched America's Got Talent and the people who knew about the egg with the last story, do watch it. You know, a lot of the singers will talk about being heavy and overweight and never feeling good enough. Or one young woman came from another country. Well, Aretha Franklin, she was black and heavy. And then, as she got older, she was super thin, which also exposed her age and what was happening to her. So I invite you to break a few rules this week. And if you heard, and if you didn't, I challenge you to find something in one of those funeral services that talk about politics. Somebody who said something, a politician who said something that you felt was kind or thoughtful or insightful or maybe even different than you had pictured that person before. And if you're really brave, you'd even open the conversation with, hey, you know what? We don't do this very often, but I think it's about time we talk about politics. This is a week where we can have that conversation because I heard different things on the news because of it. Another thing people don't always like to talk about, now we talk about it in church some, but people don't always like to talk about death. I have a good friend, he's in his late 60s, pastor all his life, and he told me the other day, he's like, you know, I'd really like to find out where my family would like to have me buried, and I've tried to talk to them about it, and they won't talk to me about my death and my funeral. He had some of his kids work in the church. I teased him a bit. What would it have been like if Cheney had not spent time, McCain had not spent time planning his funeral? We might have missed something that was important. Last night, someone shared with me a couple of funeral stories that happened here in this place, and since they happened and they weren't private, she shared that there was one man for whom his sons were very established and professional people and were sharing about the dad, and either a grandchild or another son kind of ran out, and the son said, you know, there are lots of great things about my dad, but he was always late. And then the grandson, was it the grandson? Or the son brought his ashes in at that point in the service, late to his own funeral. You know, we can laugh. We can laugh. And we can cry. And I invite you to think about sharing and doing a little planning around your funeral. Now, I'm also going to say my personal perspective is a funeral is about those who are living. And so people ought to be honored, but if there's something that you as someone who's living really wants, then it's okay to ask and talk to family and make that decision together. But think about your own funeral. Think about what brokenness you have in your life that you want others to know about so that they can see a way to get through because of God's love or the love of others, or both. Think about what message of joy and peace and kindness, what are the things that are important to you that you want other people to take away and hold and carry, or at least ponder a bit. I've sat with adult children who love their parents, grew up in the Lutheran church, then went to attend another church. And for lots of reasons, we don't attend as many funerals now. And I don't think it's just because we don't care, because I think people do care. But a whole town doesn't shut down when someone has a funeral like it maybe used to. There's fewer days off for funerals, so you can't travel and get back. So I was sitting down with these adult children, and after we went through the planning with the funeral director, they said, can you tell me what you're going to say during the service? And I pulled out the hymnal, and we walked through it. They felt a little uncomfortable asking, but I thought, oh my goodness, yes, ask. You are the family. You ought to know what's going to happen on us during your mother's funeral. I had the opportunity to help my mom plan her funeral, and not a single hymn that I suggested did she want sung. I didn't know, and I obviously wouldn't have guessed. We don't always talk about death or make those plans or even just have a conversation. And in fact, there's even a trend now going on that people say, I just don't want to bother anyone with funeral plans. I just don't want to put that burden on someone. So, make it simple or just don't even have a funeral. I understand the intention of being kind. But what happens in those situations is you're actually taking away from that family an opportunity to hear more about your own life. You're taking away from that family an opportunity to walk through some traditions, and it doesn't all have to be the same, but some traditions that help to bring healing and community and care. There was an older woman who passed away in a community where I had done internship. Now, her older son had passed away before her, and he had been cremated, and so the two of them were to be buried at the same time. He had not had any children, but he had been a school teacher in the area, and her children were no longer living, so there was a niece out in Colorado who was in charge of taking care of services. So she got on the phone with me, and she was a very caring, thoughtful person. And this was a very small community where the paper only came out like once a week, if that, and so if there was a funeral, they would literally print something about the size of a postcard and take it around to businesses to get the word out so people knew there was going to be a funeral that week. Now, she said, we'll just do a graveside burial, and it'll just be something simple. And I said, I'm more than happy to honor that. I do want to say, you just may not know who else knew your grandma, or maybe great aunt, or the man or the woman or her son. You just don't know. So would it be okay if we did do the typical announcement in the community? And she said, yeah, that's okay. And then I said, and would it be okay, now I would honor if she didn't say so, but would it be okay if I said a little bit more than just the typical graveside service? And she said, yeah, that's okay. So the announcement went out, and the day came for the burial, and it was actually a beautiful day. I just remember it being beautiful out at the cemetery. And because there wasn't a luncheon, or that before or after either the visitation or the funeral, where people share stories, which is an important part of our funeral traditions, I just openly said, is there anyone who would like to share a story? There was a young man in his 30s, I would say, who raised his hand and said, she sent me a Bible in college, and I thought it was a little odd. But she also included a note that said it pays to read the Bible. And he said, I did open it up and I did read, and guess what? I found a $10 bill tucked in there. It made an impact on his life. Enough that he remembered it, and enough that he wanted to share about it. And a few other people shared about one or the other. And afterwards, this niece, who had cared about them deeply, said, I'm glad that you did a little more. And I'm glad that we sent the invitation out. I share that with you because sometimes in trying to care about others, we take away opportunities. Sometimes when we don't talk about money, sex, politics, death, what were some of the other ones listed? Religion. Sometimes when we don't talk about those things, we take away opportunities. Opportunities to learn, opportunities to honor another opinion, opportunities to grow ourselves, to be different, or to be open to making mistakes, or to be open to share the mistakes we've made so others can learn from them. Maybe we ought to break a few rules. Maybe we ought to find that opportunity to talk about something we're maybe not as comfortable with. And guess what? Something that's going to come out is not going to be pretty. It happens. Even if you never talk about those things, something's going to come out that's not going to be nice. Sometimes that happens to the people closest to us. That's when we come back and we remember what God promised in our baptism, promising us grace and forgiveness, promising to be with us each and every day of our life until the end of time, giving us bread and wine so we can taste and smell and touch forgiveness. So then we can go and ask for and offer forgiveness to others. Have you ever said to somebody, I'm really sorry about this, and they said, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it? Why do we do that? I do it too. Some of the most powerful times, though, in my life is when I've said I'm sorry and somebody has said to me, you're forgiven. In fact, one time I really messed up, and the person I was apologizing to brought me to a baptismal font and dipped her hand in and made a cross on my forehead and told me I was forgiven. Wow. You can only do what you practice. So, I'm going to invite you to turn towards somebody and say, I'm sorry. And I invite the other person to say, you are forgiven. And do the reverse. You can share the long story about what you're sorry about after church. I'm sorry, you are forgiven. I'm sorry.
Candy back?
No. I'm sorry. Thank you. I pray that you look for the opportunities to break the rules, not out of hurt, not to get somebody sick because you don't wash your hands before returning to work, but to break the rules in order to have the opportunity for God to break in. Push yourself a little bit. It may not be very comfortable, but God only came to comfort those who are uncomfortable. Amen.